Namaste and good evening. I, Xavier, researcher at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, Prabhav Evam Niti Anusandhan Sansthan, Nai Delhi, extend my warmest welcome to you all to IMPRI #Web Policy Talk. Today, we have gathered here for a panel discussion on disaster resilience, special planning, perspectives on local and regional governance and impact. This discussion is a part of the series #Local Governance, organized by IMPRI, Center for Habitat, Urban and Regional Studies. I would now like to introduce our panelists for today. Dr. Nivedita Haran, who is former Additional Chief Secretary, Government of Kerala. Dr. Divya Sharma, who is Executive Director at Climate Group, Delhi, and Bedoshruti Sadhukhan, who is Senior Program Coordinator at ICLE South Asia. We are beyond honored to have you all with us, ma'am. And finally, we have Professor Tathagata Chatterji, Professor of Urban Planning and Governance at Xavier University, Bhubaneswar. Thank you for joining us, sir. Our discussant for today is Aravind Unni, who is Thematic Lead for Urban Poverty at Indo-Global Social Service Society, Delhi. Welcome you, sir. We are also pleased to have with us Mr. Tikender Singh Panwar as the moderator for today. Sir is a former Deputy Mayor of Shimla and a visiting senior fellow at IMPRI. Thank you, and over to you, sir.
Okay, thank you, Xavier, for that introduction. So, Arjun, shall we start?
Yes, please, sir. Good morning.
Well, thank you, everyone, for joining this discussion. And as we all know, today is the International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction. And this year, the theme for 2021 edition is focusing on the international cooperation for developing countries to reduce their disaster risk and disaster loss. So I again reiterate, I mean, it's for the developing countries. For there may be many reasons, but I think one of the reasons that is very pertinent here to mention is that between 1970 and 2019, more than 91% of the deaths attributed to climate change and weather-related disasters were reported in the developing countries. So I think there's a lot more that has to be done, especially in the world in which we are living. We are also aware very soon, it's a matter of a few weeks that COP26 will begin. But there we will be talking more about mitigation strategies. I think what this day specifically mentioned is about more to do with the strategies for adapting so that the loss to the livelihoods and to lives is actually reduced. And we have seen actually just in 2020 in India, I mean, I don't want to bring in the international context here, but we lost nearly 2,067 lives just because of floods. And if you see the cumulative figure of 15 most destructive events, so there's a report that nearly $150 billion were lost in 2020. And of course, 2021, the losses are still adding to it. The point is that this day, when we talk about adapting and strategies to meet up these challenges, I think some of the most important aspects is, and of course also not to forget and not to add, that 75% of the districts in India are actually considered to be extreme hotspots as far as their vulnerability is concerned. And this is about 638 million people living in these 75% districts. So we can easily understand that the vulnerability is extremely high. The point is, and the problem is, why we are actually building this discussion is that we started from the Sendai framework, and the Sendai framework actually focused on measuring some of the vulnerabilities in the cities. Shruti, I remember, was part of the team that did this exercise in Shimla, and we had many of those exercises. So what we intend to do through this discussion is where are the challenges? I think the first and foremost challenge is that we do not even have the measure. We do not even know what is exactly the vulnerability, and that's why we can see the phenomenal amount of number of deaths that takes place. It's not that if you count the 10 largest disasters that have taken place in 2021, maybe one or two comes to the developing world. But despite that, the loss of the lives is actually extremely high. So there is some problem actually. There is some problem in actually mapping those risks, those vulnerabilities. B, once we map it, actually what is to be done? I mean, are we able to mainstream even if we have been able to map those vulnerabilities? Because we've seen in so many cities that we have the hazard risk vulnerability assessment. We just saw in Shimla a full 6-story building actually sliding down. So what is it? I mean, where is the problem? And who takes the call? Because we have the National Disaster Management Plan, then we have the State Disaster Management Plan, we have the District Disaster, and of course the City Disaster Management Plan of actions. But actually, the CDM is not even ratified. So even if when we decide where does the problem lie, I think all those issues probably in the given time frame, we just need to discuss those, and so that A, we are able to assess, B, we are able to build the capacities of our people, and C, we are able to reduce actually human lives must not be lost just because when they can be protected, they can be saved. I think with these words, I just need to start this discussion, and Professor Tathagata, I would like you, sir, to come in and just explain the overall picture of why this day is very relevant, and not just going by the tokenism of the day, but I think more than that, what is important is what needs to be done.
Thank you so much for the very relevant introduction. I mean, suddenly, it appears to me that suddenly, in the last 2 years, we have the entire country have woken up to the issue of disaster. But I mean, we had been facing disaster for the past several years due to the climate change impact, but very few steps had been taken to address this. And now as the COVID crisis has happened, suddenly the issue of disaster has come to the front pages. The urban areas are, the most vulnerable in the COVID context. I mean, worldwide, the cities had accounted for over 95% of the COVID cases. But also in India, the coastal megacities are also, the coastal cities in general are also facing severe climate change threat. And Asian Development Bank report several years ago had highlighted that point, but not much action had happened. And so when it comes to the issue of urban resilience, so we need to understand what we mean by urban resilience. Urban resilience is defined as a measurable ability of any urban systems with its inhabitants to maintain continuity through all shocks and stresses, while positively adapting and transforming towards sustainability. So major goal of resilience is to move towards sustainability. And here comes the issue of sustainability for whom and sustainability for what. The critical question here is that disaster is not uniform. And as we have seen, particularly in the case of COVID-19 crisis, particularly the early days, the impact of disaster had been highly desequalizing, and again, it has brought out most vividly in the urban areas due to the crisis faced by the migrant workers in so many of the cities. And again, I mean, it was not the end of the ordeal. Many people walked hundreds of kilometers to reach home. But again, after the situation opened up, they again had to return back to the cities. And again, when the second round of disaster happened, many of them again had to return back. So I think, I mean, there are very few states in India which had responded to the COVID crisis in a sustainable manner. Kerala, particularly, I mean, has been the leading state in addressing the livelihood vulnerabilities of the people. The way it rose to the occasion in a very short period of time to address the multiple vulnerabilities faced by the migrant workers from different parts of the country. But here in Odisha also, Odisha government had been on the other end of the spectrum. Is that, I mean, Odisha is not a migrant receiving state, but rather, I mean, it's a state which sends out large numbers of migrants. So Odisha has also come out with certain programs to address the livelihood needs of the urban poor, and the urban poor had been at the most receiving end of the disaster, and not just the COVID. It is the flood crisis or the urban heating. So it is the urban poor, the informal sector, who bears the burn. And here comes specifically the role of spatial planning. So what do we want our spatial plans to come out with? Is it a plan for only half of the city, or the plan needs to embrace the largest sections of the city? And another crucial point here is that there is a huge data gap. I mean, we had not been able to map what is the precise size of the informal sector. We do not know. We all know that the urban informal sector hugely contributes to the city economy, but we don't know what is the quantum of it. No city, I think, has a database about its informal sector population or slum population. I think we need to have the disaster resilience. We need to have a focus on disaster resilience, right? But also the disaster resilience focus needs to focus more specifically on the issues of urban poverty and associated risks. And many of these risks are actually magnified due to the deficiencies of spatial planning, which actively makes large sections of the people informal.
So, Professor Tathagata, if I may ask you, because I think this is a very pertinent point that you mentioned, that spatial planning is so very important. Though we have some of the experts now in the present government who are saying just dump the planning process in the dustbin. I mean, we've heard Sanyal saying so, and even Kabusia throwing Kabusia and the SPAs into the dustbin. Actually, I don't buy that argument but I think, but there is still some problem with the entire planning process. So when you're pointing out this spatial planning issue, and so where is the problem, and what needs to be brought in?
I think one major problem issue in spatial planning in India, that it has for a very long time focused exclusively on land use categorization.
Okay.
So land use categorization and the master plans that had been framed based on certain land use classifications had occupied the imagination of the urban planners to a very significant extent. And there had always, I think, been at the back of the mind of the planners and many of the policymakers also perhaps, is that, the issue of informality is something transient. The issue of it would go away somehow if you plan the city. It is that, we have informality because we are not, because the city is not planned properly. But I think the time has come to mainstream urban informality itself. I mean, before we plan for it. And I mean, this point has been highlighted in the new urban agenda also. Because the global economic shift and the move towards neoliberalization. The informal sector has now become the mainstream provider of the jobs, particularly in the big cities. So we need to address the issue of urban informality through our planning processes and move away from the design orientation, which had been a big preoccupation of the planners, to an ideal city, to a framework where we engage more directly with the urban social and the economic issues. So there is a need for bringing activism into planning to some extent.
Okay, great. Thank you, Professor Tathagata. I think that's a very valid point. And in fact, that is the kind of discussion we are witnessing across the globe. Well, probably we require another webinar to discuss because this is a kind of transformation of home-based work into more where the largest accumulation of capitalism is taking place now. So how do we comprehend this situation?
Just one more point. Again, our understanding of the informal sector is very sketchy. Very often we again try to categorize informal sector as if something it is a standalone activity, but that is not correct, because there are supply chain links between the formal sector and the informal sector, and that's very, very dynamic. Second, also there are informalities in both in the shelter provisions as well as in the issue of livelihoods. So these two aspects need to be brought upfront into the planning process, and the task of the planning should be first to address the issue of providing the jobs and the shelter for the informal sector, and then rather to focus, about the land use or other aspects, because most Indian cities, most land is actually mixed use.
Thank you, Professor Tathagata. I think, Divya, if you could come in now and then speak about the experiences that you've had, especially in different sets of organizations that you've been working, and viewing this from climate change perspective, especially when we talk about vulnerabilities, like Professor Tathagata measured informality is one of the most important vulnerability, which actually is true. But at the same time, when we talk about spatial planning, especially in the urban India. So what is the problem that you find is the foremost, and which should be tackled as a priority? I can understand there are many things that have to be taken care of simultaneously, but so yeah, you can go ahead.
Thanks, Tikender for having me here and IMPRI as well. And I'm really glad that we are discussing about urban planning and relating it to disaster risk reduction at this point, because there are very limited conversations have happened in this regard in my 20 years of career. And I would not be exaggerating it, that whenever we talk about resilience and climate change, we do talk about infrastructure development, but we kind of have projectified disaster risk reduction rather than talking about the broader implication of badly designed cities. Um, and just to start with, what constitutes vulnerability to disasters? And of course, people are central to vulnerability to climate change, no doubt about it. But where does the problem arise? The problem arises that people do not own their city. And that is the starting of the problem, the tip of the iceberg. The vulnerability is also driven by bad planning or the lack of it. Vulnerability is driven by city systems and how they are designed to function. It is driven by governance mechanism, and of course, how inclusive these cities are meant to be. And I'm sure the people will discuss about inclusion, but I would keep myself to only planning uh, today. Second point that I wanted to make was that we have highly underrated our institutional mechanism to planning. For example, town and country planning organization, development authorities are highly underrated. We come up with a very huge, very promising scheme like smart cities, but we choose the smart city plans to be made and developed by consultants, sometimes even international consultants who have no context, so to say, ever to Indian cities, let alone the regional context of the cities that they very nicely set out to plan under the smart city scheme. It was a huge potential time in the history of urban planning in India, the smart cities project or the scheme itself, to build the capacity of town and country planning organization, the institution like development authority, to get to the next level, which we completely missed. Then so we just lost that opportunity to empower development authorities. The second point I wanted to make was that our URDPFI guidelines, which are guidelines or the Bible for urban planning, they were revised at one point of time around bringing regional perspective to urban planning. And it is very important when we talk about disaster risk resilience to bring regional perspective, particularly to see how urban areas talk with the rural areas and the in-between buffer systems and peri-urban and urban fringes, particularly because of the people who reside in urban fringes, particularly because of the ecosystem functions that happen between urban and rural areas that highly, drive how the disaster would impact that particular city or pointers in city. Um, we've always, unfortunately, superimposed climate concerns and environmental concerns to our city systems. And spatial planning has quite differently been taken all this while. There was a paper that I wrote as early as 2010 about mainstreaming climate resilience into development planning mechanism. And it included both planning, urban planning, as well as urban management. But unfortunately, so much work has been done, but we've not got to the crux of the problem as yet. And this is very, uh, disheartening, so to say. Um, the third point that I wanted to make was around, and yes, I just want to give one example of a project that we did in Visakhapatnam city to look at how sea level rise will impact the city. And the solution was to come up with an infrastructure inventory for the city, just to say what are those critical infrastructures that the city would need to keep operating or to make them resilient when a disaster strikes. So Vizag is a city at the east coast of India, highly prone to tsunami and storm surges. But we found that there was no, there was nothing that was thought of when these infrastructures were, located in some of the very critically hotspot areas of the city itself. And there is no way these big infrastructure are designed and, implemented, projects are implemented in the city and then removed because we see that sea level is rising or disasters are hitting these infrastructure again and again, leads to so much loss and damage, so much loss and damage, not only of life and livelihood, but also infrastructure that was built with public money and which will remain and is designed for 100 years to come, which is amazing. The other thing, and I will, if you have any question, I'll put, but you see, the way cities are perceived and infrastructure is developed, unfortunately, the path or the route we are taking is towards place making and not towards infrastructure resilience. Infrastructure has to be meant for better mobility, for better functionality, for quality of life, for social cohesion, for economic development. Placemaking, on this other hand, could influence microclimate, it could influence beautification, it could definitely influence quality of life, and sometimes cause social cohesion. These two have to be married together to make inclusive, functional, disaster resilient cities. So these are broadly my point that I wanted to make, but I'm happy for any questions that you
Yeah,
may have.
Divya, I have because I think your first point was very important, that people should own the city. But we have seen actually, this ownership is also a very dialectical process, in the sense we have seen in the Master Plan 2041, and Arvind was actually part of that campaign. Actually, there was a deliberate attempt to ensure that the people do not participate in this entire process. So, what happens over the period of time, that when the processes are such that you alienate the people, then the ownership, the sense of ownership also gets diminished. And I want to bring in Lefebvre here, who says right to the city. And when he speaks about right to the city, it is actually, the right accrues to planning. That's what he's focusing on. So how do you find it? If that, and of course, right to the city, it doesn't just mean, how you have to shape the town or your city, but also, taking into a climate change perspective. So what do you think is important?
It's a brilliant question, and I might not have the full answer to what you are saying, but see, we are dealing with the complexities of urban functionality over here and how cities operate and who these cities are built for. So if I am developing a Sabarmati riverfront, what was the idea? Who would use it and why? So these are the specific questions that need to be taken care of. When I was working in Assam and smaller cities of Assam around flood resilience, we were in Dibrugarh and Bajoli and smaller towns of that sort, and we went and we asked people about what problems do they face when flooding occurs. And the first thing and the first response that we got out of that interview was that, but we do want floods. Floods are important for us because we do rise and we have paddy fields. The problem is that the construction that is happening, the way these our cities are developing, are not only hindering us to do our traditional agricultural practices, but also floods in the in our houses and cities. So we are completely disregarding how our nature interacts with the constructed or human planning, and which is very important. And I completely agree, because I talked about complexity and how to bring people. That is where representatives of people, leadership that represent people, comes into picture, which is again very weak in our system. One leader might emerge, but that is, it will be just, it will not be a norm. Unfortunately, it is.
Thanks, Divya. Dr. Nivedita, actually, I brought in this disruption. Actually, you were supposed to speak after Professor, but deliberately I asked Divya to speak after Professor Tathagata, so that we just have a view of some concrete cities. And now over to you, Dr. Nivedita, because you worked in the government, and one of the senior most posts in the government where you shape things. Where you've been part of those state disaster management plan of actions, and of course, not to speak about your state, because your state is way ahead as far as the planning process is concerned. But overall, when we speak about general, and of course, you can bring in those Kerala experiences as well. What do you think is important in the present context when we talk about spatial planning? And to reduce our, to bring in the entire concept of DRR.
Thank you, Chairperson. No, when you, I think I assumed that there must be some rationality behind the disruption, and therefore I wasn't very surprised. But thank you for inviting me to speak. Greetings to all of you on this day of disaster resilience building. When you talk of disaster resilience spatial planning, and in modern times, I think we are very lucky that we are living in times where technology has shown us ways of doing things which we had never dreamt of before. If you are an architect or a civil engineer, or even an administrator, the kind of things that technology allows us to do now is amazing. And I say this from the point of view of spatial planning and spatial mapping, because things that took almost maybe 3 days to map earlier can now be done in 10 minutes. So geospatial planning is a very important tool in our hands now. And it's most pertinent in the sector of disaster preparedness and disaster resilience building. Why so? What does the geospatial planning do that can really help in disaster resilience building, disaster preparedness, planning our cities, etc.? Let me list a few of them. First, it helps us to place locations with pinpoint accuracy, such accuracy that it's difficult to challenge it or to ignore it. Second, it does it with coordinates, which means that you and I may be there, you and I may not be there, but those coordinates will always enable posterity to fix that location with as much accuracy as before. So whether it is the location of the flow of a river, or the roads passing through a village, it is now, nobody can challenge that. Nobody can say that, no, the river was actually, this was the course of the river earlier, because the data will show what was the case and not what one thinks was the case. And thirdly, with the availability of AI and BDA and all these technical tools, it is one of the easiest and quickest way of pointing out connectivity, availability, and suitability. So you see, decision makers can now take advantage of GPS planning and GPS mapping in a manner that was unheard of even 25, 30 years back when I was a collector, for instance. Now, let me also hasten to add that a lot of this data, GPS accurate data, which I just mentioned, is already available. It is available in the context of land management. It is available in the police department, on the location of the police stations. It is available in health department, where it is already known. They have already mapped where the hospitals and health centers are located, schools, etc. So what the first speaker mentioned, professor mentioned about the data gap, sir, I don't think there is a data gap as such. The gap really lies in using the data, sharing the data and using the data. Why do I say that? I say this, and I want to give an example and mention this, that sometime about maybe 10, 12 years ago, we had a severe boat tragedy in Kerala, in Munnar, in a place in the hilly station of Munnar, near Munnar. And the biggest problem at that point for us was to get first focus lights, floodlights, and second, boats. The easiest and quickest way we could get boats and floodlights. And what really helped us was the GPS maps that were available, which showed the location of where the floodlights were available in the nearest police station, in the nearest municipal office, or where the boats were available. So you see, it is one of the best tools that is available now for good decision-making processes. And same thing holds for even more complicated equipment like choppers and ambulances, road earth movers, and so on, which are all required when there is a major disaster. Vulnerability, and I would like to share this with you. One of the best equations that defines vulnerability, explains vulnerability, is the following, which I've come across. Vulnerability is equal to inequality into poverty, of course, divided by awareness plus capacity. Now, if you see, each of the factors in this equation have to be handled at the lowest possible level. It cannot be done at the national level or at the state level. It can be discussed, it can be collated, it can be prepared and put into reports. But if you wish to improve the awareness level, you have to do it at the local level, at the panchayat level, at the municipal level, at the ward level, in fact. If you want to improve the capacity of the people in protecting themselves and facing a disaster, it'll have to be at the grassroots level. One of the models I want to mention to you, which was started in Kerala and which then spread to other states also, is what is called the task force models. What was done under that model was very simple. At the lowest level, so whether it is the ward or the panchayat or the municipal level, that's the maximum we went up to. What was done was task forces were set up, and these task forces were supposed to be attending to the following. Not just when a disaster happened, post-disaster, but also for resilience building. 1, medical services. 2, community shelters. 3, the special problems related to the vulnerable sections, especially children, senior citizens, women, etc. And 4th, dissemination of information. We found that nobody could do the dissemination of information better than these task forces, because they were right at the local level and they knew at the grassroots level, and they knew who needed what information, regardless of, rather than spreading information widely, they knew how to target the information sharing. Now, what are the problems in this? Why is it that we still continue to talk about lack of urban planning or not abiding by urban plans and so on, as the previous speakers mentioned? Let me quickly list the problems that come to my mind and that I think should be our target areas. 1, the lack of interdepartmental and interagency coordination. We are a society where we refuse to share information and share data, not because we are willfully wanting not to share, but because we feel that, kyun share kare? Why should we share? The need to share whatever data that we have should be inbuilt in our psyche. So whether it is the mapping of our roads and rivers, whether it is the location of our public services, whether it is the location of our offices, that should all be shareable. And that holds even for the private sector, private hospitals, private availability of expertise, nurses, doctors. That data should be shared, which is not, unfortunately, shared. Second, we have this problem of lack of delegating. We again, at every level, and I am seeing it I have seen it ad nauseum in the government, and I'm seeing it in the non-government organizations these days. It is always an empire building. We would not like to, there's a resistance towards delegating authority. We have to learn to delegate. And the more we delegate in disasters and disaster management, better will the management be. I can tell you with 100% guarantee. Thirdly, within the local bodies, unfortunately, and that should not be the case, when the Panchayati Raj institutions were thought about, they were supposed to be apolitical. At least after the elections were over, they were supposed to be apolitical. But somehow they have become extremely politicized. And to the extent that if something is to be done in a certain area, in a certain ward, if the mayor happens to be from a certain political party, he would choose a ward where he has won, his party members have won. I think we have to overlook that. In disaster management, there can be no politics and definitely no politicking. That's out of question. Fourth, like everywhere else, petty corruption. And disasters are most prone to corruption for various reasons. Less questions are asked. The funds are often not audited properly. And a lot of things can be done without following too many procedures and questions being raised. But one has to understand that questions are not raised and procedures are simplified in disaster management because time is of essence. You cannot afford to do things after going through the whole process of taking orders and getting things approved. And therefore, delegation and delegated powers doesn't mean misusing those powers. And finally, when we talk of urban planning, I think the previous speaker mentioned about plans failing and how smart city has failed. Smart city has failed because of us and not because of the people who were planning it. And of course, they are also responsible, but it's because of us. We need an exception. We want everything to be done as we wish. That is not how a plan works. A plan is prepared, approved after required discussion, and then it is to be implemented and enforced. It cannot be based on exceptions. And what comes to mind, and especially seeing that the chairperson in today's discussion is from Himachal, I cannot but mention the orders of the Apex Court, which came sometime in the early 2000s on how planning has to be at the grassroots level and how exceptions cannot be permitted and how public servants have to ensure that anything they do are doing it with a sense of public service and with a sense of public responsibility. Anyone who wants can look those up. Justice Kuldeep Singh's orders on these areas, on protection of water bodies, on protection of rivers, river flows, etc., etc. So urban planning is very good, but it is as good as we make it out to be. And that is what has happened. I know in Odisha, they have come up with some very good plans on management and rehabilitation of slum dwellers. And I was dealing with them off and on. And I thought that what they are doing is very good, but often the support from the public, from the larger community is lacking. And that, I think, is probably the tragedy of all that we do. We have to get together and we have to ensure that when something is done, it is done with due consideration and with due seriousness and a sense of, togetherness, which often is lacking. I think I've taken enough time.
No,
so
thank you. That was interesting, Dr. Nivedita, and in fact, bringing in the perspective of provincial government, how a provincial government functions. But yeah, I think you mentioned some of the important aspects as far as tools are concerned, as far as technology is concerned. We'll discuss that. I think probably Arvind will speak about that because that is also an important aspect. How good is good data? Yeah. So probably later we can talk about that. But thank you, Dr. Nivedita, for really pointing out those 4 or 5 important points, and I think what also needs to be done. I think we'll take a question later on, maybe once we have it from the participants here. So over to you, Shruti, if I can see you. And what I think because ICLA is a very large network of cities, where cities actually join this membership. And ICLA has also been responsible to preparing a large number of city plans, measuring the greenhouse gas emission inventories, even measuring hazard risk vulnerability assessments. So you know quite a lot about the complexity of the system, how it functions. So apart from speaking about what you've been doing, and actually in some of the good case studies, actually what is the complexity that needs to be addressed? I think that is more important today when we speak about on DRR, and maybe we could create that space for more discussion.
Thank you, Tikenderji. I actually was thinking that I should mention about the problems that I mean, there are a range of issues that municipalities are facing when it comes to disaster risk reduction. And I mean, our previous speakers have been talking about some of them. Nivedita ji mentioned a range of issues that the government in general is facing. I will try to focus on what the municipalities, the local governments, generally the urban municipalities that I'm working with actually, the kind of issues that I see in these places. So I think the first thing that we see is the capacity level. Not to say that nobody knows anything. They are really highly qualified engineers in the cities, but then they are not really planners. And we haven't actually come across cities which have a very strong planning department, which can actually bring together different departments. Like Nivedita, you was mentioning, there is the interdepartmental coordination is lacking. That we have seen in every city that we work with, to the extent that population data, something as simple as population data, which we would assume that it is just based on census data, even that is sometimes different in different departments. So everybody is following a different population data to do their planning. So, I mean, it's kind of amazing how that can happen in a city. But yeah, that's there. I mean, the technical knowledge, even if it is there, the ability to link that technical knowledge to disaster management, to things like sustainable development goals, to think like climate resilience, these are all upcoming issues, right? They are not, these things were not there 20 years ago when people had started working, and they're always changing. It's always developing. So the ability to link these issues, it's very rare that we see it in municipalities. Then there is the thing about technically knowing how to conduct a vulnerability assessment, risk assessment. We don't expect that there would be obviously trained scientists within a municipality. That's not possible. But they need to know where to go. If you want a data on vulnerability, if you want a data on risk, where do you go? Who can give you? And there are people who are doing these studies, which is their job to do. And they're even within their cities, all the cities have universities, all the cities have their science departments and environment departments. These universities can provide this information. There are people who are researching on these issues. You can always easily reach out to these issues. Nowadays, actually, even government has come up with good reports, and they can be used in the absence of localized information. So if you don't have local level vulnerability reports, at least you have a regional report which you can access. So these are the things which you need to be able to do, and they don't know how to do this. So I mean, it's not that they don't want to do it, but it's something that you need to be able to process the data. Just looking at the data is not enough. You need to be able to analyze the data and then use it in your work. So that's that link is missing. There is an issue about jurisdictional limitations when it comes to disaster management. Disasters generally managed by the district governments are responsible. Municipalities will do what they are told to do, and they're not really directly responsible for managing the disasters. So it's not often that you will see a full-fledged city development, city disaster management plan, which is there. There are cities who are developing it now because they're repeatedly facing disasters. So they are realizing that this is important, and they've started working on these things, but it's not common. It's not everywhere that you will find this. And then you might find disaster management plans for one particular disaster, not for everything. So you might have a heat resilience plan, but not really a flood resilience plan. So all these things need to be integrated, and that there should be something which is common that the city can use actually. And lastly, I think there is also a problem about accessing finance. I mean, even if you do have a plan, you need to implement it. How do you implement it? So there is, I mean, it's not to say that there is not enough commitment. There is, of course, enough commitment for climate disasters. But then there is a limited flow to the local governments, to the cities at least. They cannot directly access funds from international sources. They have to go through national government nodal entities and so on, which is not a problem. The problem is preparing the technically strong proposal to actually go through that process. So because they do not know the linkages between climate change and urban development, or SDGs and urban development, so to be able to access the funds which are related to climate change and to make the urban development sustainable and resilient, they will not know how to do this. So and then that also comes from a need of data. Like you were mentioning, we have developed climate inventories for several cities now, and every time we do that, we have to collect this data from a range of different departments. And this brings us back to our interdepartmental coordination, which is lacking in the cities. And so it's basically a cycle which goes on and on and on. And unless you actually try to address several parts of these problems together, it's very difficult to manage. So
Shruti,
this
I have a question to you. Actually, what we have seen is, especially with the smart cities, as you're pointing out, that you require a scientist, a climatologist, geologist, and a hydrologist, definitely. But what we are witnessing is, because of the push for the infrastructure and what Divya was mentioning, you very rightly mentioned, what we have done is, and I can tell you, there is a congruency between urban flooding in the recent past and the smart cities. Wherever these smart cities infrastructure projects are being constructed, you find urban flooding, actually, which was even unheard of in some of these towns earlier. So, so what needs to be done? Because there are reports. But the point is, I can understand, I can even disagree with who prepared, even if the report is like not too good, but there is a report, okay? But then who owns that report? Because every time you go again, you have another report. Because that report doesn't actually go into the consciousness of the people, doesn't catch their imagination. And the authorities actually go back to square one, and they work with their own tools. The kind of tools that they have through their own wisdom, and what they've been doing, convention in the past. How do you break this? How do you bring this disruption so that, hey, there is a document, there is something lying here. Please follow that. Let's not do this in the future. So what should be done? Because or has any city been able to do it?
This is something that we have been trying to do, and this is something that we have been telling cities to do for a long, long time. It's extremely difficult for various reasons. Corruption, like Nivedita ji mentioned, is one, but there are also other reasons. Political priorities change. People's understanding change. So once the power changes, then the understanding changes. So 3 years you're working on a particular issue, you come up with a brilliant report, and then the next government comes in and their priorities are completely different. And then that is shelved and something new is going to be worked on. So it's extremely difficult. What we as ICLEI try to do is to see that whatever plans that we make, for one thing, we try to get the municipalities to talk to stakeholders. We tell them that you need to form a stakeholder group. We don't care who you invite, but it needs to have certain categories of people. So there has to be somebody from the universities, there has to be people from the private sector, has to be people from NGOs, communities, etc. So we have a range of people that we need to include whenever we are having these kind of planning discussions. When we help them make their climate resilience plans, we tell them that we will not work with only your environment department. There's one person sitting in the environment department. It's not possible for him to do the entire job. It's not also right, because climate change is a cross-cutting issue. How can that person solve everybody's problems and the other departments will not follow the plan? So what is the point of making this kind of a plan? So what we tell them is that we need to form a core team within the municipality, which includes different departments, and not the heads of the department, because they never have time. So we always try for a middle-level person who will actually sit, and then not very junior also, because then he won't have a clout, but trying to bring a balance between the seniority level and the ability to actually take things forward, to do some work. So this kind of a thing, we try to make these institutions within the municipality. And what we tell them is that any data which is collected, any report that is made, everything needs to be passed by these committees, and everything needs to be vetted by them. So whatever data is presented to them, they need to agree that, okay, yes, this is what we will be following. This is okay, this is acceptable for the city. So that's something that we try to do. We try to encourage them to be more inclusive in their processes. So we have ground level meetings, like ward level meetings and so on, when we are, particularly when we are trying to do, pilots in the city. There we try to engage the community to the maximum extent possible. So those kind of things, we try to engage with women, with any other urban poor people, the migrants, etc., like slum dwellers and so on, try to engage with them regularly. And because like ICLEI works with the municipalities on an ongoing basis, it's not really project-based relationship with the municipalities. So what we basically tell them is that, our project is for 3 years, but we are going to be there with you forever. So that way we try to build the relation with the cities also, so that they can trust us. And we have been able to do that with several cities in India, actually. And they are understanding the technical support that we can provide them. So they understand that we can actually link their projects when they want to do a climate related activity, or some data that the government is asking for, which is climate related, and they don't know what to do with it. They actually come to us. They come to us saying that, help us with this. So we try to do that. We provide these we have some simple tools which the government officials can actually use. And not just for this inclusion mechanism, but also for, integrating the different sectors. How do you actually engage with the different sectors? How do you analyze them? What is the problems that each sector might be facing, say, because of climate change that is happening or will happen in next 20 years? How are you, if you're going to invest in your water supply mechanism, then how do you make that resilient? So if you're going to put in 100 rupees in this, if you can just add 10 rupees more and make it 110 and you make it resilient, so that's worth it. That's put that 10 rupees. So that's
well, one of the projects, let me just put it on record. In fact, there's a researcher who's doing work in Shimla. And, it was a association between the city government, and of course, I was the deputy mayor at the time, and declared rejuvenation of water, natural sources. And it's one of the most important interventions that we were able to do. The small fund that we got from ICLEI, and then of course with lots of things. Yeah. So even if when we don't have water supply, so there is the natural source, which was contaminated, but now because of this intervention, now the people get. So thank you, Shruti. So I think that is some of the areas where we can really intervene more for decentralized, more for empowering people. Arvind, now over to you. But there are 3 points that I want you to raise, apart from the overall discussion that you've heard, what do you bring out of it? You remember when we were going to the School of Planning Architecture, because I was a guide to, I think, the 50th students, and I took Arvind also along. And what both of us, we made them do, probably they will be cursing us all through our lives, because this was, they were very young students, and they had to do a project on homeless. And the moment we saw their first draft, it was like I wouldn't say horrific, but it was like quite scary because the entire terminology was they and us. So, they who are homeless and us who are planners. And apparently that is true for our planners. In fact, the way we are planning cities, they do not know how to move about in a bus. Who are homeless, informal sector. That doesn't mean that only the informal, someone who's in the informal sector will design and plan. That's not the point. The point is, and then we made them actually stay 24 hours in a homeless shelter. They stayed there, those students, and prepared for one of the finest reports that they could have. So this is actually true because, the parastatals are preparing the development plans of the cities.
Right.
It's neither political, answerable to the political establishment, nor is it engaging with the people, as Prof. Tathagata also mentioned, and then we have heard Dr. Nivedita also. So, what do you do in such a situation? How do people reclaim their right?
Right.
What Divya was also saying, they should own the people. Two, at a very macro level, what do you do in such a situation? Take for example, because of the large glass capital around the world, the kind of typologies we've built. If you just go to Delhi, I've been quoting this Lady Harding Medical College. You see the old Lady Harding Medical College, where you have a maternity ward that sustains without an air conditioning facility. But you have a modern building with all those glass typologies where you cannot survive even for a minute without the air conditioning. So this push for glass typology now after COVID pandemic, we are realizing it's a disaster that has happened. So probably we'll be revisiting our architects, our designers will be revisiting those designs. What I want, I don't know, but what I want you to speak about is, what do you do in such situations? Or as Romy and all have been saying, that go back to the basics, let even planning be done by our local institutions, and quite at the ground level, they are more sustainable. And I actually laugh at times, because of the looming power crisis. What if we do not have fuel at home? What do you do? What if you're central line? Well, all these are funny questions, but I think these are important questions.
Right.
When we speak about urban. So yeah, over to you, please.
Right. Tikenderji, I think my opinion on let's say both of these questions would actually be that one, reclaiming is very important, because the way our cities are being done, development plans. So one point that I would like, so I'll make the point and then give you examples. So one, reclaiming is absolutely important, because planning is a very powerful tool, very useful tool, like the way Nivedita was also mentioning. But the fact is that tool and that usefulness of that tool is being used by a certain section, and a huge majority in our cities are not able to engage with that tool. So that usefulness, usually because it's done in our cities, which is the cities of Global South, that usefulness actually backfires. And the way you have our cities, the way we have right now, is partly the result of a very powerful tool at the hands or in the hands of wrong set of people, institutions, agencies, so on and so forth. One example of that is that even after, as we are nearing 75 years and we have already started the celebrations, I think the latest Niti Aayog report says that around 60% of our cities do not have plans or have outdated plans. Point number one. Point number two is that on the contrary of seeing planning as apolitical, we people who engage with plan, because we work on development plans in cities and with communities, we want to bring back the politics in the plan. So let it be contested, and politics, not the party politics, but the politics of, where is our share? Where is our share to resources? Where is our share to land? Where is our share on the road? So on and so forth. So those are the things that we want to bring back into the discourse, and we are doing it step by step. We don't know how far or how long that will take, but that is the attempt, or that is the direction that we are moving in. So that was my response to, in short, my response to the questions that you posed. I would want to just start and give a couple of examples before, posing a few questions, mostly because we engage not from a disaster management perspective, but especially after a lot of what has happened in the last 1.5 years during COVID. Even though IGSS as an organization has a DRR, but it used to mostly focus on rural. I'm absolutely handling urban issues, and I'm a practitioner, so I'm coming in with that perspective. So four instances of what really shook me up, at least personally, on what could be done with disaster risk, resilience, and how do we adapt as we go forward. One, look at wave number 1 that we had in our cities. All the migrants were kind of moving away from the city for very obvious reasons and very obvious and strong reasons that they had. The only place that we could accommodate them were homeless shelters that were already crowded, the shelters that the government does not want to invest in anymore, but they didn't have any other options. So they packed all the migrants in those homeless shelters. But when you have a master plan debate, which you're having right now in Delhi, again, you see that DDA is not interested in making shelters and is fine with that number, because we think that COVID was a rarity and it just happened to be a huge disaster. It might not happen again in life, so why bother? Second, COVID wave 2, yeah. What we saw in wave 2 in Delhi and many other cities, and sometimes we saw that smart city control rooms were being used for monitoring, so on and so forth. That's all, I feel, one way of kind of diverting the attention from the real issue. The fact is that at least when I was in Delhi, for 15 days, I couldn't see any government, local, city, or national. I mean, all were one, or none were present, right? So that is where we really have to think of how do we use the community strength that we have, because at that point, it was only the communities that were working. Point number 3 is that Delhi now just has a draft master plan that's being done. And what you see is, in terms of disaster risk management or response, you only have 2-3 things. One is that you have a reservation for a disaster management unit, which is for every 5 lakh population, you will have a unit. Second, you have a disaster management center at a national, at a city level. It really misses the bus, or like doesn't see the elephant in the room or all around us. It doesn't bring the disaster discourse closer to the climate crisis that we're facing, and for a plan that's being done for the next 20 years. When we are actually debating of 1.5 degree, 2 degree, and how do we control it in the next 3-4 years, you are having a 20-year plan which does not go beyond refuge spaces or little references to building codes, so on and so forth, and that only talks about flood, fire, and earthquake. This is the context that we're dealing with. My bigger questions that we should think, ask, bring into practice is point number 1. Is don't see disasters now, especially when you have it with climate crisis and the whole equation of disaster changes, is that disaster for urban, working class, working poor, urban marginalized is daily. It's a daily disaster that they have. Homeless, when they're out on the streets and they're having to face 45 degrees Celsius temperatures on the street, street vendors doing their work on the street, if they're having to face this temperature on a daily basis. So this is not like a COVID once in a 10-year or like a flood or like a fire. This is a daily occurrence in their lives, which has an impact on their health, livelihood, house, lot of things that we can't even conceptualize at this stage. Point number 1. Point number 2 is that conventional practice, let it be urban planning, because I come from that background, or let it be disaster management, and the whole approach to our cities is fundamentally flawed, because we don't understand that our cities, like Professor Tathagata was mentioning, are majorly informal. Where you stay, where you live, where you work, so on and so forth is informal, right? So there is a hate, neglect, or vilify kind of a response that conventional urban practice, urban planning practice, or disaster management practice has against informality. One, they hate this because all their standards, all the building construction codes are meant for concrete buildings. They're not meant for slums, no? Or even the small fire tender, that design is still stuck on the idea that you want a 6-meter throughway. I mean, you can't do that in Delhi, right? So the fact that the fire tender still doesn't get in your most of the urban settlements, and the fire rages on and causes what it does, but you have not thought of innovative ways of how to deal with it. You are still stuck with that 6-meter thing that you want. So hate, neglect wherever possible, hate it because you're not able to deal with it and your standards don't match. And sometimes you are attacking the informality, which is the predominant mode of city in our urbanization, rather, in our cities. You are attacking informality, saying that they are reason for floods, they are reason for fires, they are reason for so on and so forth. So that mode needs to change. We have to understand that unless we engage, change our standards, change our norms, change the way we look at informality, this is not going any forward. We are in big trouble. Last point is the problem of course, we have challenges of disasters. The problem gets more furthered because of some practices of the state and as well as agencies that are completely top down. So one point of why smart cities fail is a sort of a magnification of why development plans fail. Why they fail is that they don't engage with people, communities, lived realities, they're far away, and done at a city level by experts or so-called expert agencies. Now the smart city, which comes from even farther, has partly failed because it's failed to take even the local elected representatives on board of what you need to do. So you're forcing a very top-down idea, and I completely agree to the point that I think one of our folks mentioned, that unless disaster management is looked from community up, there is absolutely no way that we're going to deal with this and engage with this process. My last conclusion of, again, 2-3 points, then I'll close. One is, of course, mainstreaming disaster and decentralizing the response, preparedness, mitigation, so on and so forth. Unless we do that, and there is already existing debate, I don't know from where, of how 74th constitutional amendment should be revisited. Why are you revisiting? Empower 74th constitutional amendment to further decentralize and empower the ULBs to act on issues of disaster risk adaptation and mitigation. Second point is, I completely agree with the idea of Atmanirbhar Bharat. And Atmanirbhar Bharat in that sense is communities, community strength, because their ownership might not be for the city because the city didn't give them anything, which is why the migrants walked out, right? But communities where we work, they care for their communities, they care for their informal settlement or slum, as you call it, and they're willing to fight and die for it. So I'm just kind of putting it very strongly. So we have to use our community strengths, ensure that we are working on the ideas of disaster risk resilient communities, then get to wards, then get to city, then probably imagine something at a national level. Unless we look it upside down, that will not happen. Last point from my side is, look at all the vulnerable groups. They all have different disasters, their different challenges and their different contexts. There'll be waste pickers, there'll be informal workers, slums. So all require different responses. One top-down view of how to deal with disasters, building construction codes, n number of things that you have will not work. So hence we need to definitely do a revisit, if possible, on all the NDMA Act. I think high time we thought about it, because when it was conceptualized 15-20 years ago, that has changed completely. We have to revisit the TCPO planning norms, UDR FPI guidelines, because at the moment they are not even closer to what we really want to do. And we are doing that through 3 ways. I'll close it with that. One is to actually assess, and IGSS and bunch of civil society organizations, one, to really assess and capture what is the impact on the urban poor and marginalized, because we have to really, in a disaster, you have to look at the last people first and get them on board, and then others would be fine. So really capture and assess how different population groups are impacted by a host of for disaster, and then look at policy change. So those were a few points that I wanted to kind of place before you. That's it.
Okay,
Sorry.
I think that's been very nice intervention. And I cannot see any questions, Arjun, in the question box. So what do you do after this, Arjun? Are you there?
Go to a way forward round, and all the panelists to respond to many points which you have also raised, sir.
So I think we go by that. And Prof. Tathagata.
Yes.
Yep.
Are you there, sir?
Yes, yes.
So I think that you've listened all the speakers, and including Arvind, and so I know. I mean, it's a serious challenge, and when we talk about adaptive strategies, and there are many things which we talk, but ultimately the call is taken by the government, and the government is still bent on quite vertical, quite top-bottom approach. So what should be the way forward? I mean, though we have some very interesting community and bottom-top interventions that we've seen, but we've also seen top-bottom approaches. For example, in Kerala, where they were able to mainstream. I mean, you go to a taluk and to a district. I mean, you can find 15 layers of mapping being done, and that empowerment has taken place of local bodies. So it's quite a mixed kind of thing that we are witnessing. So the point is that disasters are going to happen. The point is the frequency of the disasters are going to increase. The point is, how do we reduce the number of losses, both in terms of monetary losses and the lives that we lose? Because this is the year for the developing world, as they say.
Yeah, Tikender ji, thanks again. I would cite one discussion I had with Charles Correa, one of the, just few months before he passed away. So I asked him about this issue. I think we all of us are looking at this issue of planning and why does not plan work. So I asked him also the same question, and the response that he gave me, he gave me a reply. That was in the context actually of disaster. So I would like to cite that. He said, how we plan, it is something like, when we're talking about the issue of shelter and disaster. So he was saying that, when it is like when people are dying because they do not have food, what do you give them? Do you give them food, or do you give them a recipe book? So he said that, our planning is somewhat like a recipe book. But from that we need to turn it into food which can be eaten right away. So I think the point that Arvind mentioned is very, very important. And so when we look at this issue of disaster management at an urban local body level, so we need to, not only to make disaster resilient plan, or rather, making disaster resilience should be the main item of the plan. And and that plan needs to be at the local area level plan, the ward level plan. The disaster resilience plan has to have a ward level plan and then it needs to go up and link up with the higher spatial scales and management decision-making structures. And that again, when we talk about planning at a ward level, I think we need to look at the issue from the informal settlement and the slum. Is a disaster of this category, what should happen to the slum? In terms of its, again, most cases, what we see in India, that one aspect of disaster is obviously the physical aspect of disaster, life losses, etc. But its lingering impact on the livelihood is often disregarded. So we need to take a sustainable livelihood framework as a part and parcel of the planning process, which unfortunately we don't do. Our planning still remains focused on the physical planning aspect, whereas we need to look the plan from a livelihood aspect, and then look at the issue of how physical capital, financial capital, etc., link up to build on to the livelihood of the people. And so instead of starting from the top, we need to start the plan from the bottom and then go up. But obviously, no city can be completely bottom up. Even a city like, we also need to be practical here. So even a city like Porto Alegre, which is famous for its participatory budgeting, has a budget. Almost half the budget, that is the trunk infrastructure, that is planned through a top-down intervention, whereas the bottom-up local level infrastructure is planned through community level, ward level participatory processes. So I think in Indian cities, we need to strike a balance between these two scales. And third issue is that we often talk about decentralization to a city. The question here is, what do we exactly mean by decentralization? Do we mean decentralization only in terms of administrative devolution of power from the state level to the ULB level? Or we mean a political decentralization? So, because I'm raising this question because we had been discussing the issue of Kerala and Bengal also to an earlier extent, where there was a large amount of political decentralization from the upper tiers to the lower tiers. Whereas in Odisha and many other states, where there had not been any election to the urban local body for the last several years, the ULB's term had expired way back in 2018. Even in Bengal, the ULB term had expired in 2018, and there had not been any elections so far. So, when we talk about decentralization without political accountability, without elections, so are we not, just doing only some kind of administrative stepping down? I think, we need to match that administrative stepping down with bottom-up political empowerment.
Thank you, Prof.
That's
Dr. Nivedita, your last words, if you're there, for the way forward.
The bandwidth was poor. I was not hearing very clearly, so I had switched off my video. Yeah, I think it was interesting listening to all of you and hearing what the ideas were and what was shared and knowing where it was coming from. But I think all of us agree that the vulnerability, to reduce vulnerability, one has to tackle poverty. Yes, of course, that's goes without saying. But at the same time, one must make sure that that attempt starts at the lower level also, at the grassroots level also. I think that is something that we all agree upon. And the second point that I think all of us are agreeing upon is that the planning process is, of course, important. But then it has to follow the procedure and has to take in the inputs from all possible stakeholders. I have to sound a word of caution here, because having been part of one of the master plans of Delhi, I remember, it's not often very easy or very advisable to take too much advice from the so-called stakeholders or the general public. Because one has, even if one does that, one should know where it is coming from. Because all of you familiar with Delhi would know that there are a lot of vested interests amongst all kinds of, all sections of society. But one should know that, you know, a city, as the chairperson rightly said, the city is for everyone. It is not just for the people living in Lutyens area, or the people who are living in the colonies or the old city. It's for everyone, whether it is the migrants or the higher classes or the lower classes, everyone. The city belongs to everyone. And therefore the input should come from all levels, all sections, and the planning should take into account all these levels. I think that is most important. I think that's what I have to say.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Divya, can I see? I can't see you. I hope.
I'm
You
here,
there?
very much here, yes.
Yeah, please. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Yes, very quick points. I think Nivedita ma'am and Professor Chatterji have made my job very easy, but I will still, like to stick to the topic that was given to me in terms of planning and how. See, the one point that I want to make again is that land use planning, the way we do it, as well as infrastructure, has a lot to do with the impact of disasters on city systems as well as its people. There is no denying the fact. And therefore, when we talk about disaster resilience, we will have to actually go back to the basics. I completely agree with the point that Nivedita ji had made earlier about institutional silos. So way forward would be that we should look at a way to break institutional silos. We should not look at city as a water resource department, as a road department, as a PHED, and a planning department or a development authority. But how do all these together build a sustainable, resilient, functional city, which is up for economic development for the citizens of that city and give them a good life? And when I say that, mainstreaming some of these issues like climate change impacts, like disaster resilience, and others, even social cohesion, equity, gender, safety, all these issues, mobility, have to be mainstreamed into this institutional framework. And taking from Professor Chatterji, I completely agree with him. I think I would call it vertical integration. Whether it is top down or bottom up is something that we have to decide. It cannot, as I said, be always bottom up, but it has to be participatory. It has to be collaborative. And we have to see how some of the dynamics between state and city and its citizens are dealt with more maturely than we have been doing in the past. So that would be my last remark. Thank you.
Shruti, if you want to add something.
I think all that I wanted to say has already been said by my previous speakers. So I'll just leave with maybe one point that, municipalities, local governments, they need to understand the cross-cutting nature of disasters and climate resilience and urban development. So what they need to do is basically to integrate these concepts in a more, more than what they're doing right now. And one of the major, breakthroughs that cities can actually do, or what we have seen is that if we can somehow get these plans, the action plans that are being prepared, if we can get it into the municipal budgets, that helps them to start this integration with urban development and with climate resilience. That actually, because they don't really, not always do they have a separate budget for climate resilience, separate budget for environment and so on. But if we can do that linkage and help them to integrate it into their municipal budget. So for instance, if we say that, rainwater harvesting is good for your water resilience, and we can actually allocate some budget under the water department for rainwater harvesting, then it automatically lets them spend some money on building more resilience into their systems. So this is just one thing which I would just like to mention at the end. Thank you.
Arvind, your last words, and then probably Arjun will take over.
Yeah. Okay. So my last words would be that, like, picking the exact case of Delhi, the point that Nivedita mentioned. So the last plan had local area plan provision, which meant that you could actually do a lot of things in the local at the local level, involve communities and work with people's groups. This plan, for some reason that is not revealed to us or anyone, does not have the provision of local area. So what we see is that this is not a question of either or, in the sense that we are not saying that this has to be top down, this has to be bottom up. But what we are seeing or what we are feeling when we look at how planning is being done is that the leave bottom up, the spaces of engagement of communities, peoples, and vulnerable groups within the planning process of, let's say, the cities is very quickly reducing and moving away. And smart cities being one very clear example of how it's even furthering away from the people and their needs. So we feel that this is not a question of either or. We have to say that both of them have to go together, and frameworks have to be made where people's participation is encouraged and ensured. That would be my probably last comment. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Prof. Tathagata, Dr. Nivedita, Divya, Shruti, and Arvind for this interesting discussion. Probably just to lay a foundation of for more to follow in years to come. Because this year we've seen. I mean, it's not that I just have to mention that data, but the challenges are immense, and right from measuring vulnerabilities to actually putting the onus on. I mean, right from community participation. I think all that is extremely important. And then we have some wonderful examples where the community has really come forward, and as Arvind pointed out in Delhi. But not to miss the point, Arvind, that state has an important role. I mean,
absolutely.
Not to ensure that the state negates its important role, and we just reclaim that right of ensuring that the state is there for us to function. I think over to you, Arjun.
Thank you very much, sir. So such a stimulating session today. We extended our time by almost a lot. But thank you very much for joining today on the occasion of International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction. On behalf of IMPRI Center for Habitat, Urban and Regional Studies, I thank all of you for joining us today on this very pertinent panel discussion on disaster resilient spatial planning, perspective on local and regional governance and impact. And I would like to thank each one of you, our panelists, Dr. Divya Sharma ma'am, Dr. Nivedita Haran ma'am, Prof. Tathagata Chatterji sir, Bedoshruti Sadhukhan ma'am, and Arvindoni for joining in this very excellent discussion, I would say, very calm also. And thank you so much to our moderator, Tikender Panwar sir, for leading this important deliberation and encouraging us to do so. I would also like to thank those who joined here on YouTube and later watch on YouTube, and those who will be watching in Facebook and or listening to our podcast. Thank you all the participants, and I wish you all a very nice day, and we hope that you tune into our future episodes of Web Policy Talk. Thank you and have a nice day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.